Welcome back, everyone. Today we are diving into the story that's been kind of blowing up in the game dev world,
Yeah, it's been everywhere online.
the Godot drama.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're listening to this, you probably at least heard whispers about it.
Yeah, you can't really avoid it if you're plugged into the game dev scene at all.
But maybe you're thinking, like, okay, an online spat. Whatever. People fight online all the time.
Right.
What's the big deal?
That's the internet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, the fallout from this has been really interesting. We're talking accusations, a whole new contender entering the scene, and really some serious questions about how open source projects should work.
Yeah, it's snowballed into something much bigger, like way beyond just a little internet drama.
Definitely. So for anyone who needs to get up to speed, quick recap. Godot's community manager blocked some users on social media, right?
Yeah.
Right. And these users, they were criticizing how Godot had handled a previous situation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on the surface, that might not seem like a huge deal,
Right.
but think about it. Open source projects live and die by community engagement.
Absolutely.
So when people in that community feel like they're being silenced, that's a big problem.
It's a huge red flag. It really gets to the core of what open source is supposed to be about. Collaboration, transparency, give and take. When that breaks down, it can be really damaging.
And would you say that rather than trying to smooth things over, Godot's official response kind of poured gasoline on the fire?
I think it definitely had that effect, yeah. Their statement tried to defend their actions, but I think a lot of people saw it as deflecting. And then using the term, using the term abuse to describe the criticism, I think that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, especially because some people felt like the community manager was actually the one or part of the problem in the first place. So you get this perception of hypocrisy, and that just fanned the flames even more.
It's like, it's not the crime, it's the cover-up.
Exactly.
Sometimes just a sincere apology and a promise to do better, that can go a long way.
Absolutely. Acknowledging you messed up, and then even more importantly, actually outlining how you're going to fix it, that's how you rebuild trust.
Yeah.
And that didn't really happen here. Instead, things actually escalated because then Juan Lineto, who created Godot, he enters the chat.
Yeah, and this is where things take kind of a turn. Lineto basically says he's done with Twitter, he's stepping back, and he's attributing the criticism he's getting to like people who just don't get game development.
Yeah.
Or people who have a political axe to grind. What did you make of that?
It was interesting. I mean, on the one hand, you can kind of understand where he's coming from, right? He's poured his heart and soul into this project.
Yes, his life.
Exactly. And now he's facing this like wave of negativity. It's got to be tough. But on the other hand, I think his statement kind of misses the mark. By saying it's just people who don't get it, he's basically dismissing the very real concerns of the community. And that's a problem.
It's almost like he's saying you wouldn't understand, you're not a real game developer. And that actually brings up a really important point for our listeners, especially if you're new to open source. What do you think this situation says about Godot's future, especially for folks who might be thinking about using it or even contributing to it?
It's a really valid question. I mean, Godot is a great engine, right? It can do a lot. There are already tons of games made with it, some really impressive stuff.
Yeah.
So you can't just ignore that track record. But this whole situation, it's got to make some developers hesitate, especially if open communication and community, if that's really important to them, I think they might have some second thoughts.
Right. Because when we're talking about open source, trust is huge. It's like currency. And when that trust gets damaged, it can have some real consequences for a project.
Definitely. Everything from people actually using the software to people wanting to help out and contribute. Even getting funding or finding partners can be harder.
And that actually brings us to, I think, the most interesting part of this whole thing, the rise of RTO. So tell us about RTO. What is it, and why is the timing of it so interesting?
So RTO is basically a fork of Godot. In the simplest terms, they took Godot's code and they're building their own thing with it, creating a separate project, but it's still rooted in that same code base. Now, forking, that's not unusual in the open source world. It happens all the time. But what's fascinating here is that RTO is very openly positioning themselves as a response to all this drama with Godot. Like they saw the community's unhappiness and they're saying, hey, we hear you.
So they're not just forking the code, they're forking the whole philosophy behind it, in a way.
Exactly. And they're being really smart about it. They're putting a huge emphasis on the community. Like, community needs over corporate needs is basically their slogan.
It's on that.
They've been doing open forums, getting feedback directly, and they seem really committed to being transparent about how they make decisions. That's a breath of fresh air for a lot of people.
They've also been really good about, like, taking the high road, even when things got kind of ugly on their end, right?
Absolutely. There were actually attempts to dox members of the RTO team, which is just awful. And unfortunately, it happens way too often in these kinds of online blowups. But what did RTO do? They condemned it, obviously, said it was unacceptable. But they also told their own community, don't stoop to that level, don't retaliate.
Classic.
Yeah, and I think that speaks volumes about the kind of community they're trying to build, one that's based on respect, even when there's disagreement. And that's so important for any open source project, but especially a new one trying to gain traction.
Okay, so we had this fascinating dynamic, right? Godot, the established player, with some serious PR problems and the potential for, like, long-term consequences from all of this.
Sure.
And then on the other side, we have RTO, the up-and-comer, riding this wave of community support and offering a different way of doing things. So for our listener who's trying to figure out the world of game development, what does all this actually mean for them? It's kind of like you're at a crossroads, right? And both paths, they could lead to something cool, but there are risks too. You got to weigh your options.
Yeah, and that's where really understanding what each engine offers, like technically that becomes super important. Godot, because it's been around longer, it's got a lot going for it.
Yeah.
Tons of features. People have made a bunch of projects with it already, so there are tutorials and stuff out there. And it's known for being pretty user-friendly, especially for beginners.
It's like the safe road.
Right, exactly. You know it's going to get you there. It might not be the most exciting, but it's reliable. RTO, on the other hand, they're still really new. They've got the heart of Godot, that code base, but they're still building on top of it. So it might be missing some stuff, some polish. But the people who are flocking to it, they're drawn to this whole community-driven idea, the potential for it to be something really different.
The road less traveled.
Mm.
Might be riskier, but maybe more rewarding in the end. So for someone listening to this, it's more than just which engine do I pick. It's about figuring out what matters to you in a development community. What would you say are some key questions people should be asking themselves as they're checking out both Godot and RTO?
I think the biggest one is, honestly, what kind of community do you want to be a part of? Like, are you cool with a more top-down structure
Right.
where there's a core team making most of the decisions? Or do you want something more open, more collaborative, where your voice can actually make a difference?
Because those are two very different ways of doing things.
Night and day. And then second, I think you got to think about, like, practically, what do you need from an engine? Do you need something that's super stable right now that already has all the bells and whistles? Or are you okay with something that's still being built where you might even be able to help shape the future of it?
And that's where actually downloading both, messing around with them, that's huge, right?
Totally. Don't just take our word for it. Download them both. Play with the interfaces. There are tons of tutorials out there. Try them out. See what clicks.
Like test driving a car. Right.
Exactly.
Mm.
You won't know what you like until you get behind the wheel.
I think this whole thing with Godot and RTO,
Yeah.
it really shows how much the open source world is changing. It's not just about the code anymore. It's the people, the values, the whole philosophy behind it.
And honestly, that's what makes it so exciting to be a part of. This Godot and RTO thing, it's like this little microcosm of what's happening in open source everywhere. People are realizing how important community is, how important it is to be ethical, how much power we actually have when we work together.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that tech, it doesn't just exist in a vacuum. It's made by people, used by people. And those choices we make, they matter. So as you're diving into game development, remember, you're not just choosing an engine. You're choosing a community, a way of doing things, maybe even a whole philosophy.
It's a journey.
It really is. And who knows, you might even end up shaping the future of game dev. It's an exciting time to be creating. Well, that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you next time.